All right, so we got a pretty big update here on the ongoing Cold War between the United States and China, where the United States, alongside Britain and Australia, have decided to form basically a new military alliance or a new military coalition to deter China in the Pacific. So let's go ahead and read some of the details here from Kenny Stansel of Common Dreams. Anti-China military pact threatens peace and stability in the Pacific, groups warn, and the announcement of the new Australia, Britain, and U.S. military alliance called AUKUS, I guess is how you would pronounce that. Maybe it's AUKUS, I don't give a fuck. But AUKUS represents a serious escalation of the new Cold War on China. So what are some of the details here? Well, anti-war advocates are denouncing Wednesday's formation of a trilateral military partnership through which the United States and the United Kingdom plan to help Australia build a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines, a long-term initiative broadly viewed as a challenge to China by Western powers determined to exert control over the Pacific region. So these are actually not like nuclear, they're nuclear powered submarines. They're not actually like nuclear armed submarines necessarily. So there's a pretty big substantial difference there, but still ramping up the military tension by providing Australia, which is, if you don't know, on the other side of the world from the United States and is closer in line, vertically at least, with China, and obviously has more of an influence within the Indo-Pacific region. And so we're basically helping them to acquire new nuclear powered submarines to then have traversed throughout the Pacific and basically act as a deterrence to China, apparently, or at least that's what they're trying to say. So they continue saying that although Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and US President Joe Biden did not mention Beijing specifically during their joint video announcement of the so-called AUKUS alliance, the move is widely seen as a response to China's expanding economic power, military reach, and diplomatic influence, the Washington Post reported. Quote, China is believed to have 6 nuclear attack submarines with plans to increase the fleet in the next decade. And obviously, this has to be taken with a grain of salt, or at least within the context that the United States obviously spends roughly $750 billion to $1 trillion a year on our military budget, more than the next 10 countries combined. China spends roughly like $250 billion a year on their military. So the United States alone, even without Britain and Australia, are already spending 3 times as much as China. This comparison between our militaries is totally ridiculous and absurd, and you have to understand that every time you see mainstream media outlets coming out and saying China is expanding their military reach, okay, go look at a map of where U.S. military bases are around the world. We have military bases, over 800 of them stationed around the world, that are basically surrounding the exact outlines of every single country that the United States determines to be our supposed adversary or enemy in any given context. If anybody is to be the aggressor in these military confrontations, it is the United States, and it's really not even close. But they continue saying that The Guardian noted that it could take more than a decade for AUKUS to develop submarines propelled by enriched uranium, which allow the attack vessels to operate more quietly and remain deployed for about 5 months, quote, but once at sea, the aim is to put Australia's currently diesel-powered navy on a technological par with China's navy, the world's largest, so essentially just turning Australia into a vassal state for the United States that we can use to deploy military operations against China if need be. And they continue saying that in addition to cooperation on naval technology, the newspaper reported that the partnership will involve closer alignment of regional policies and actions and greater integration of the militaries and the defense industries of the 3 allies, which also intend to work together on cyber warfare and on artificial intelligence capabilities. So it's not just the nuclear submarines, it's also on artificial intelligence, it's also on cyber warfare, it's also on just generalizing our for-profit military industrial complex that we have here, allowing Australia and the UK to join in on this process, as they really have been doing throughout the last number of decades, as we have been partnered with these 2 countries for like basically a century now in military confrontations. But they continue with a quote from Biden saying that during his remarks publicizing the new pact, Biden claimed that, quote, we need to be able to address both the current strategic environment in the region and how it may evolve, because the future of each of our nations, and indeed the world, depends on a free and open Indo-Pacific enduring and flourishing in the decades ahead. So what do they mean by free and open? Well, obviously it's open for interpretation, right? Everybody's going to read into this in different ways. People who are big fans of Joe Biden and liberals will look at this and say, oh, well, yes, they're just promoting, the freedom and democracy and something about free markets or whatever the fuck. But I look at this and I see free and open Indo-Pacific, enduring and flourishing in the decades ahead. What this to me looks to be is just the same old capitalist imperialist propaganda propaganda that the US and our allies, including Australia and the UK, have been using for decades in order to justify overthrowing different governments around the world who happen to oppose our economic hegemonic interests. And it can also mean opposing basically the military of the United States having our will in anywhere across the United States, and this includes in confronting China. So basically that's what that says to me. Free and open Indo-Pacific means please let us continue operating our sweatshops in all of these different countries in the Indo-Pacific and keep exporting cheap commodities to the United States so that our consumer base here can have cheap products that were made with sweatshop labor at a very good value and a good price. So that's basically what that means to me when they say a free and open Indo-Pacific. They're obviously pushing against the influence of China in this context, and so that's basically the situation that we have right now. There's very little details. They came out. They did a joint press conference between Scott Morrison, Boris Johnson, and Joe Biden, where they came out and they talked about this. They focused pretty heavily on the nuclear submarine aspect of this, but really, it's pretty obvious what this actually is, okay? This is basically a new NATO for opposing China, okay? It's a military alliance. It's allowing Australia, and I happen to be half Australian. If you guys didn't know that, I don't know if I've actually mentioned this on this channel before, but I am half Australian. My dad is from Australia, and I've been there a number of times. And listen, Australia in the Indo-Pacific, in terms of their influence, right? Australia is a very tiny country, right? It's a country of, I think, like roughly 20 million people that live in Australia. So, you know, I mean, it's a very small country and has a very small economy and very small military influence compared to the United States. But that basically is their purpose, essentially, in this military alliance, at least, is acting as, again, a vassal state or a military base in and of itself for the United States to then go and impose our economic agenda, impose our imperialist agenda on China and countries within the Indo-Pacific region. So it looks to be like that's exactly what this is. It's not something that's going to be promoting peace and freedom or anything like that. It's basically just an aggressive alliance that has been formed between these three countries that have already had alliances and military operations throughout our history together. Obviously, the UK and Australia both helped us in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and have been committing war crimes along us all the way along our sides and basically doing the exact same imperialist shit that we have been doing around the world. And it seems like this is just going to be a continuation of that tendency and that tradition between our three countries.